when managing React state, you might run into an issue that isn't maybe particularly clear what's going on when you first notice it, especially, if you're a little newer to some of the nuances, let's say, to managing React state. So let's say that you have, you know, this is of course like a contrived example for our demonstration purposes here. But in our case, we have this scoreboard and we have player A's score to where they can increment their score, but then the user can go ahead and go to the next player. So we switch to player B, but we see that the score doesn't change here, which is probably not what we want from a state perspective. We probably want to reset the state here when we click next player or toggle back and forth between player A and player B. So let's look at the code here. And what we have going on is we have our scoreboard, we have our is player A state right here that we default to true. And then we have a button that will kind of toggle our player back and forth. And then we have our logic right here to where we check within this div, is player A, then render our counter component to where our person prop is set to player A, else render player B. So pretty straightforward here. Like this doesn't look too dissimilar to how you would, maybe structure your own code here. So what's kind of going on here? Like it looks like we're rendering two separate components here, but when we toggle back and forth between rendering this and rendering this, our count within our counter component, the count just kind of remains the same. And if you saw my last video, you kind of know what's going on here. So state isn't necessarily specific to like this instance of the counter component or this instance of the counter component. State is more specific to a certain component within a certain position in the React tree. Regardless of whether we render this counter here, player A, or render this counter here, player B, we're still rendering them in the same position in the DOM, in the React tree, so to speak, right within this div component. If that's true, one way that we can fix this is we could, and I'm going to show you what I think is maybe a little bit of a better way, or kind of more so my preferred way. These two ways are not the only two ways that you can solve this issue, but one way just to fix the kind of issue of rendering them in the same position is we could render player B within a span here. So player A is rendered as a direct descendant of this div within the tree, but player B, it's within the div, but it's also within the span. So we've kind of nested it a little bit further in the tree. So now if we switch back and forth, let me just refresh for good measure. I'll increment A here. Next player, you see that the score gets zeroed out. So just by rendering them in different positions of the React tree, we see that it actually resets the state here when we shift between our two players, which in this case might be what you want. Now, what I think is potentially a little bit of a maybe better way to do this without needing to add more nodes within your tree is you can actually, similar to how you render lists in React, you can actually render a key for each of these components here. So I'm going to render a key for person A, and let's just use the key of A. And then for person B, I'm going to render a key that is equal to B. And this should have the same effect. And I'm going to refresh for good measure. But let's increment, next player, increment, next player, so on and so forth. And you see that it resets the state here, because this is effectively telling React that, hey, since we added a key for these two components here, then they should kind of be treated as their own kind of separate components with separate state. So toggling back and forth between these is still going to reset their state, even if they're in the same position in the React tree. And this would probably be my preferred way to kind of solve this issue if you run into it. So yeah, I think that's all I got for you here. I hope that was helpful. It might not be particularly evident if you run into this kind of initially and you don't really know what's going on, but hopefully those solutions make sense there and that this video makes sense. But if not, let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in the next one.